Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the fourth webinar of the 2021 EMOS Webinars program. My name is Caterina Giusti. I'm Professor of Statistics at the University of Pisa in Italy, where this session is hosted. And today I will also act as the webinar facilitator. Now, let me first explain for any newcomers that EMOS stands for the European Master in Official Statistics, a joint project of universities and data producers in the EU member states, EFTA, and EU candidate countries. If your university is interested in applying for the EMOS label, please consider that a permanently open call for universities is available on the EMOS dedicated page on the Eurostat website. For staying in contact with the EMOS news and community, please follow the EMOS Twitter account. The account is @EU_EMOS. It's now time to start with our webinar. Before I give the floor to our speaker, let me first explain briefly how we run the webinar today. As you can see this here, the EMOS webinar stream on the EMOS YouTube channel, where you can already find the recording of the past webinars. As a participant, you can watch and listen to the webinar. To use the chat to interact with the presenter, you need to log in YouTube using a Google account. Today, we encourage you to pose your question during the presentation so that we can decide to take a break so that our presenter can reply to your question. Otherwise, of course, we will have time at the end for the final discussion. For any technical problems, you can use the email address that I already indicated in the chat. So now we are ready to start. Today, I have the great pleasure to host Pamela Campanelli. Dr. Pamela Campanelli is a survey method specialist, chartered statistician, and fellow of the Academy of Social Sciences. She's also an international trainer, researcher, and consultant who runs her own business, The Survey Coach. Her background is in social statistics, survey methodology, and psychology. She's interested in survey error and data quality throughout the whole survey research process. Her focus is on questionnaire design, cognitive interviewing, sampling and weighting, and mixed mode and web-only surveys. In addition to providing consultancy, conducting research, writing papers, and reviewing for journals, advising committees, Dr. Campanelli has provided training courses across the world from Brazil, Chile, Armenia, Kazakhstan, Thailand, Malaysia, Hong Kong, Australia, and the USA, as well as across the UK and Europe. Her passion is to raise awareness and improve quality in surveys whenever she goes. So today, Pamela will present to us about cognitive interviewing for testing surveys. So Pamela, the floor now is yours, and I will see you later for the questions.
Okay, thank you, Caterina, and welcome everyone. All right, so we see here a lens for cognitive interviewing, and that's not just a pretty picture. I truly think it's a good metaphor because cognitive interviewing actually lets you focus in on the respondent behavior when answering a survey question and can tell us a lot about the quality of the survey question. So, cognitive interviewing is a type of in-depth interviewing which pays explicit attention to the mental processes that respondents use to answer the survey questions. Now, it's really important that this is distinguished from cognitive interviewing, which the police use for interrogating witnesses to crime. That's under Fisher and Geiselman. And it was quite humorous here in the UK. This is back around 1996, when the Social Research Association first hosted the very first ever course on cognitive interviewing. And I was there teaching, and a third of the audience were from the police. And they were equally shocked as we were shocked. So we now always advertise the course as cognitive interviewing for testing survey questions. Okay, so what are these mental processes? We can see these four stages from when a respondent perhaps hears the question through an interviewer, or when they're reading it from online or paper questionnaire. I'd like to illustrate, first of all, with a factual question. So I'm going to take a sad example of a woman that was in a car accident and badly damaged her left knee. And the question we want is, how many times have you been to the doctor in the last year? Now, if we just think about comprehension for a moment, I'm just checking that, yes, my cursor moves. So just thinking about comprehension for a moment, the word doctor is very ambiguous because here in the UK, we would probably think about our sort of basic first contact doctor who would be a GP, but that's going to be different in every single country. And then also talking about the last year, that's ambiguous because sometimes people will think the calendar year or the financial year or the academic year, when really to say that the past 12 months would be much clearer. Okay, so let's say our respondent with a knee injury gets past that. And then we come to the recall stage. Now, if you haven't been to see the doctor at all, or maybe once or twice, that's quite easy. But our respondent, she's in the UK, and you can't get to the specialist, you can't get to the physiotherapist unless you go through the GP. So, she had an operation to begin with, but she's unhappy with levels of pain. She doesn't like the physiotherapist that's recommended, so she's just in the GP's office all the time. Okay, so how's she going to remember that? Well, she's working really hard. She's trying to be a great respondent. So she finally comes up with the idea she's gone every other week. Okay, so she thinks 26. All right. Then we get to the judgment phase. Now, if people are going through these steps in a really motivated way, then they're going to recognize that sometimes when you try to remember something, there's that little bit extra, it's kind of itchy. You think, I know there's something else. And it may take a moment for you to think about that. So we have a very motivated respondent here. So she thinks about it and then realizes, it was a fungus on my toenail. Sorry, a little bit gross, but not very memorable compared to the knee injury. So it'd be very easy to forget. And that actually involves 4 visits to the doctor in terms of clippings and getting feedback and back and forth and back and forth. Okay, so she's now up to 30 visits. Okay, then it's time to give the response. And 2 things are going on here. First is we, the researcher, typically have put answer categories. What if we haven't given an exhaustive set of answer categories? What if we had 0, 1 to 2, 3 to 5, 6 to 10, 11 to 15, end? So it's not 15 plus. And she's in category 30, which doesn't exist. Okay, that's the problem for the researcher. Second thing that happens here is sometimes people will think, ooh, if I say that, not our respondent, but another respondent in the same situation might say, 30 times, if I say that, it's going to make me look really ill. And I'm not, it's just this knee injury. So sometimes people will give a more socially desirable answer. But sadly, in this case, we had somebody who was going to tell the truth, but no answer category. She's got to go into the 11 to 15 category. Okay, so that's an example of a motivated respondent. You could have a respondent who is kind of skipping stages. You can have respondents who don't thoroughly think about recall, and therefore judgment isn't helpful. It's shortcuts. So if we were trying to think about how many hours somebody worked, just changing the topic for a moment, people might just take an available answer. My timesheet says this, or I'm contracted for so many hours, and not actually think back day by day about how many hours they put in. Or maybe they're just going to think about a representative answer, what they usually do, or a little more sophisticated, and these are all things that respondents have done. Anchor, okay, anchor could be your timesheet, and then it's adjusted. So it's a little more sophisticated. I can adjust it for the 3 hours I spent on Thursday night. But these are all approximate. We're not actually getting the true answer. They're all just shortcuts. So we just have to be aware respondents can do that. And then a last comment on this is if you were to have subjective questions. With a subjective question, you can still have ambiguous terms. You can still have problems of social desirability and the researcher not providing the right categories. But it is possible that the middle two categories are different. So I'm going to pick on a non-European target, former President Donald Trump. Now, I'm only picking on him because people tended to already have a well-formed attitude. It wasn't when they saw the survey question that they have to go back in their mind and remember. So if they've already had a well-formed attitude, then they validly could skip these middle two and just come down and give their response. So sometimes that can happen also. So cognitive interviewing is very much about trying to see where there are mishaps in these 4 cognitive steps when somebody is answering a survey question. So a little bit more about this. Generally, we do this in person. Of course, that's pre-COVID. So it would be nice, using some kind of software, like we're using YouTube software at the moment, so that you could actually speak with somebody live. And that's so much better than using the phone, because one of the important things about cognitive interviewing is actually watching the respondent and where they might find difficulty, you can see in their face and their behavior and so forth. Or if something's upsetting, it could trigger an upsetting event. Rare, but we need to see these things. Okay, ideally the sample should be from your population of interest, somewhere between 15 and 35. And it really depends on the type of analysis you're going to do. If you're just doing a simple analysis, and we'll talk about this later in the webinar, as opposed to looking at subgroup differences, then definitely different sample sizes. We definitely want to audio report it, because if you're interviewing, you're sort of under stress at the same time as trying to be a researcher. So it's so good to have it audio recorded so you can go back and say, all right, what actually did the respondent say, and then I said that, and what does that mean? And it's just so important. And then the analysis is most often qualitative, although with cognitive interviewing, and heavens, I've been doing cognitive interviewing 1985, I had to think about that. I used to work for the US Census Bureau. And then it wasn't necessarily qualitative, it was a whole thing in its own, not really quantitative or qualitative. Okay, so cognitive interviewing is really a set of tools. So we have people thinking aloud, I'll say more about that in a moment, and then you have the interviewer probing, and then this all-important observation of our respondent, which I've mentioned. And there's also some other tools, paraphrasing, rating tasks, response latency, card sorts, and so forth. Now, I've actually created an appendix with this material because to try to fit in everything I wanted to tell you in 1 hour just wasn't going to work. So there is an appendix, a separate document with information on those particular tools. So, thinking aloud. This is encouraging people to say their thoughts out loud when they're answering a survey question. And it's, I'll give you some examples. And what you can see is you'll find places where people are talking through, and then you can see where their confusion is, and then you can see where they maybe missed part of the question, or they're confused, or they think they're not confused, but they misinterpret it, and just so much valuable information about the process comes out. And at the same time, we can also use some probes. These are very much like respondent debriefing questions or web probing, if you know either of those techniques. So they're specifically designed in advance because we want to check whether a particular word is ambiguous or if a task is too difficult, and so forth. So here's a think aloud example. Do you own a swimming pool, Or is the swimming pool available to you at your residence? Well, I know I don't own a swimming pool because I live in an apartment. It's a pool and complex, but it's an outdoor pool and they drain it in the winter, so not really available to me now. I think they fill it up in time for the summer holidays. Right now, I guess I'd say no, not available. Okay, now if we were a bit more interactive, I would ask you, what did we learn from that? So I'm going to have to play both roles, my side and your side. So usually some of the comments that people make is, what does available mean? Because it's ambiguous. Does it mean available meaning you could jump in the pool right now, or does it mean the structure exists? And then also we notice that there's no time frame in the question, and that might make a large difference because obviously outdoor swimming pools are seasonal. And we could also think of it as two questions in one, because ideally we first want to know, does the respondent own a question? Own a question. Can I take that back? Own a swimming pool? Yes or no? And then secondly, do they live in a place where there is a swimming pool? And maybe even before that, we want to find out where they live. So we could actually ask this in a much better way with a series of questions. Now, I find that having someone think aloud in a web survey or paper self-completion is really useful because you can see where there's some visual layout problems. So I picked on a US 1990 census form because there actually are some visual problems in it. And I'm going to role play being an interviewer and a respondent, just so you get some feel of this. And I'm going to exaggerate a little being the respondent just because it's fun. So I'm going to look at my bigger screen over here. Okay, so Mr. Jones, thank you so much for agreeing to do this interview. As we said in the letter, we're testing out the US 1990 census form. So what I want you to do, I'm going to give you a page at a time. So we're going to just start with the first page. And I want you to fill it in as you would do at home, just ignoring that I'm present. And, you know, if you would skim over something, that's fine, do the same. So just pretend you're at home, fill it in. The only difference is I want you to say out loud whatever is coming through your mind. Okay, switching roles. Now I'm Mr. Jones. Oh, let's see. I don't think I should have agreed to this. I think this looks too complex. I don't know what to do. Oh, wait a minute. Please fill one column. All right, that's fine. All right, last name Jones, first name Thomas. Okay, that's fine. Now what do? I'm looking. Oh, start. Start in the column with the household member. Yep. Whose name? Owned or rented? Okay. Yeah, we own it. Yeah, that's fine. That's my wife and I. That's just fine. So, oh, maybe this is not so bad. There's a circle for me. There's a circle for my wife. And I'm white and Asian. Yeah, I guess that's closest. A mark for her. Print one group. Have no idea what that means. Okay, I'm continuing down this column. Oh, I think you've had a problem with your printer. There's an ink spot. Right. Okay. Age, yes, 92. My wife was born in 1925. All right. Now married. All right. No. Hispanic? Yes, Hispanic. No, you've got another problem with your questionnaire because neither of us are Hispanic and there's not room for both our answers. Okay. Excuse me. It's fun being silly. But what is truly wrong with this form is the fact that you know the most eye-catching space on a questionnaire or on a screen is always upper left. So that's where the eyes go first. And it's also bold, so it stands out a little bit. But the problem is the arrow, because please fill in one column. And in real life, we watched people do this. Come down, fill in the first column without ever reading any of the actual survey questions or instructions. And this became quite a known problem with this form. So the 2000 form for the next census wasn't in this format. It was still in columns for different people in the household, but the question itself and the answer categories were all in a column together, and that solved that problem. All right, a little bit more about thinking aloud. You know, some respondents report their thoughts really easily, some don't. So we might need to give them some encouragement. And we also need to reassure them there's no right or wrong answers. And in the appendix, I've got a little bit about how you kind of structure and conduct the cognitive interview, which I think will be helpful for you. Now, a key thing is if they're thinking aloud well, you're supposed to do nothing but listen and observe. Have you ever, not in cognitive interviewing, but you're talking with a friend, and all of a sudden they interrupt your train of thought, and you don't remember where you were, and it's disorienting. So that's why the interviewer should not interrupt the think aloud. So in big letters, do not interrupt the think aloud, unless for some reason the person is way off target. And then in any interview, whether it's quantitative, qualitative, or cognitive, you have to gently bring the person back on topic. Okay, some other things. If somebody goes silent for a moment, gentle things you can say. Remember to tell me your thoughts. What's going through your mind? What are you thinking about now? And it could be because you're looking at the face that we can see, ooh, you look puzzled. Tell me what you're thinking. Now, it's really important to get the timing right, because I've trained up lots of new cognitive interviewers, and sometimes the new interviewer errs because the respondent's gone silent for 1 second, and they jump on the respondent by saying, tell me your thoughts. And the poor person is just trying to swallow and breathe. So, so that's too quick. But I've also seen the complete opposite, where the person's gone silent for 10 seconds, 15 seconds, 20 seconds. And that's way too long. So the more you do that, the more you get the right flow of timing so that you don't lose information, but you allow people to relax and be comfortable. Then the other major part of cognitive interviewing is asking probes. So this is a list of probes that Debbie Collins, she's another major person in the UK who does cognitive interviewing. We've taught together on many occasions. She also has a book out on cognitive interviewing. It's an edited volume. Okay. Doesn't mean this is, you know, the final list, the absolute list. It just gives you some ideas. So maybe we're observing and then we can ask some probes, or based on listening. And ideally, you want to prepare your probes, because probes need to be good questions. And if you're winging it and just spontaneously doing something, there isn't guarantee. I mean, you can't be spontaneous. And sometimes we are spontaneous because it is more qualitative in nature. But it doesn't hurt in advance to write some probes for the things you really want to investigate. So we have some general ones here. And then thinking about the different stages, comprehension, asking people to put the question in their own words is a type of comprehension, the paraphrasing, recall, judgment, sensitivity, things visual. So anyway, possible list. So when do we use our probes? If a question has obvious problems, fix them before you go out and test. So cognitive interviewing should be used at a point where you think the question is as good as you can get it, but you're just a little bit unsure. You're unsure, let's say, whether the word neighborhood is going to be clear or not. Is it really a problem? So what you want to do then is to create a probe to ask the respondent how they understand the term neighborhood. And then you can see, is it actually a problem or not? And remember, you're doing this over a set of respondents, because it could be the first respondent seems very clear about it, but other ones don't. So then you're trying to see how much of a problem is it. And of course, that's a more quantitative view, which is how cognitive interviewing was first done. But for the qualitative version of it, it's looking for the themes of what might be a problem. Okay, so here is an actual question from a UK health and lifestyle survey. Would you say you now are a non-drinker, a very special occasions drinker, an occasional drinker, or regular drinker? And I use this particular one, it's very poor, along with a few others when I'm training new cognitive interviewers. And you can see the new cognitive interviewer has just prepared 2 probes. One is the type of paraphrase. Can you say that to me in your own words? And then there is no reference period. So the cognitive interviewer has put in a question for that. But if we were to look at this, there's just so many ambiguous terms. So what's now? I mean, that's now. and then what do we mean by drinker? Is it actually alcohol or not? What do you mean by regular? And actually, to measure alcohol consumption, I mean, first of all, to get the units, and that differs by country, and that's very difficult, putting that aside. But ideally, you want to measure frequency and quantity and not try to put it in this odd scale. Because, you know, someone could have 1 glass of champagne on New Year's Eve, and that's so regular, but, you know, that doesn't fit on the top of what this scale looks like. But another reason for putting this here was to give you a transcript from a trainee interviewer, so you get a little bit more feel for what this is like. Here we are, our next question from the survey. Would you say that you now are a non-drinker, a very special occasions drinker, an occasional drinker, or a regular drinker? I never really understand what these questions are about, because what is regular? I'd say between occasional and regular, but then again, I do have a couple of drinks a week, so I guess that makes me regular. So it's probably regular. Well, yeah, the weekends I have a drink. Yeah, put it that way. So it's regular. Okay, that was the respondent in the Think-Aloud. And then there's a probe. And it's this probe here. Can you repeat that question to me in your own words? And here's the respondent. Am I a regular, occasional, or special occasion drinker? I can't remember the last one. Now, normally, interviewers don't help in this kind of case, but the interviewer does and says it was non-drinker. And then tries the probe again, because that probe completely failed. So this is just showing the flexibleness of this. Is there any way you would have said that differently? It was just a pretty bad probe, but it got a great response. Let's just hear. Yeah, sure, I would have said. Are you a non-drinker, an occasional celebratory drinker, a regular drinker, or a drinker who drinks too much, more than the daily recommended average drinker, i.e. a heavy drinker, or do you ever binge? So I would go 2 scales above yours. Rather than having regular at the top of the scale, it's definitely 2 more levels above regular. Otherwise, I'd be a pisshead, and I'm not. And then the interviewer gives the time question, and the respondent says between now and the beginning of the year, and this was done in February. Okay, so I hope you saw some value in the Think-Aloud, because we could see how sensitive this was without having to ask any probes to see if it was sensitive. Okay, so the most typical thing is for the, in an interview survey, it's all concurrent. So the interviewer reads the question, the respondent thinks aloud, and then the interviewer probes. And you want to do it in that order, because if you probe first, then the Think-Aloud is going to be based on the probes, and we don't want that. We want people's first reaction to the question and what they're thinking about it. And then the interviewer goes to the next question, respondent thinks aloud, interviewer probes, and you just continue like that. That is the most typical use of cognitive interviewing for an interview survey. Then for self-completion, we want to actually detect visual problems. So what we want to do is we want to have the respondent think aloud over a larger part of the questionnaire until there's a natural break. So they're on their own, and that makes it feel more like self-completion, and then they can relax and, you know, actually feel they're doing it by themselves. And then when they finish that part of it, then the interviewer probes, and then the next section, and the interviewer probes. So it's a little bit different with self-completion. I've got far too much to say, but I was going to comment on a teacher time use diary. We had one day of the diary was one day of a teacher's time, and it was a perfect segment for having the teacher think aloud through that whole diary. And there were 82 different codes that the teacher had to pick to fill in what he or she was doing within 5-minute time slots. Crazy, yes? So anyway, one of the things we learned from that project is that teachers multitask, even on top of all of that. So they might, particularly with younger primary school students, they might have given a lesson while they're marking lessons. Okay, so ideally you need a training course in cognitive interviewing. So there is the knowledge of it, but there's also the skill, because it's a skill to become a good interviewer, know when to probe and not to probe, and the right probes, and so forth. I had the great good fortune to teach for Eurostats with Mark Platt from Statistics Austria, where we taught cognitive interviewing 2016, 2018. So again, I'm sure we will. And of course, there are cognitive interviewing classes in many places. Okay, I'm just going to talk to Katerina for a moment. Do I have lots of questions piled up now, or should I continue?
For the moment, we have one question. If you want to reply, it is about how long should the Think Aloud interview last? Some suggestion about that.
Yes, so there's some time at the beginning where we introduce it. That's in the appendix. And then people aren't thinking aloud the whole time because we're probing. But the whole thing should be about an hour, hour and a half. You don't want to go any longer than that. And then there's some things we do at the end because that would just be too much of a drain on people. So about an hour, but sometimes the intro material can take 10 minutes, follow-up material 5 minutes. So that's really only 45 minutes if we're taking an hour. So that may mean if you have a longer questionnaire, you have to chop it into parts and try cognitive interviewing this part and that part and so forth.
And we just, thank you. We received just now another question, if you want, just very briefly, so we take a little break. So how is it possible to reach certain categories of people who are not very familiar with digital tools, such as the elderly, during this period? That's difficult.
Yes, I would say that's a fieldwork question rather than cognitive interviewing. So can I say that till the end?
Okay. And we have also just received maybe a linked question is about if there are evidences on specific targets, youngster versus elders, for example. I think it's about maybe how it works to use these techniques with these different categories.
Yes, it can be used with everyone. There's lots of evidence, and it can be used in lots of different languages, and it's been used in lots of different countries. I mean, sometimes there are, I don't want to say stereotypes, but sometimes I've done it with young people, and you know, they want to just go out and play, not pay attention. And other times young people are like really committed, and you know, sometimes I've interviewed the elderly where, you know, they just want to talk to you rather than do the interview. And then you can decide, yeah, well, I will talk to them afterwards because they're just lonely. But that's not in all cases. So, you know, you can't just make a generalization.
Okay, thank you. So I think we can go on. Yeah.
Okay, we'll go on. Thank you. And apologies to participants. This is just the time of day and the time of year where the afternoon sun gets me. So I'm going to keep moving to get out of the sun.
Don't worry. We can see you.
Okay. The question is, can I see the slide?
Yeah.
The sun in my eyes. All right. So we're going to do a little bit about trade-offs in writing questions. So a little bit of tips about questionnaire design. So here we have a question, reason last saw doctor. And if we could have more time to be interactive, I would have you tell me all the problems with this. But I'll just name a few. Remember, doctor is a problem. And it doesn't say why we're seeing the doctor. You could live in a small town, so you saw the doctor, you know, to go for a drink after work. Doesn't necessarily mean medical. Okay, so what happens with writing survey questions is it's about stages of polishing it. So maybe we start with something naive and very poor, because that's not even a sentence or a question, and then we polish it a bit and it gets better. So this version is slightly better. So we notice now that it's a full question, and it now says medical problem. So what was the medical problem or reason for which you most recently went to your GP? Using GP, which is what would be clear in the UK. But it's still not perfect, because in the English language, as opposed to Spanish, just as that contrast, in Spanish, there is you singular and you plural. But in English, those are blurred. So somebody could validly answer about going to the GP thinking in a plural sense for a family members, thinking that you is my whole family. So I went because of my son or daughter, something like that. Also, just because it says medical problem or reason, and it's an open question, people could say things that aren't helpful, like because I was sick. Because people don't know what their medical diagnosis is, or even if they do, they're not going to give it in the medical terms. So that's a problem. It's much better as a closed question, where we maybe have 20 big categories of things that might be wrong with a person. All right. And then does it count if you speak to the doctor on the phone? Especially, you know, during COVID times, it's different. So after all those questions, or maybe you just go to the doctor to pick up a prescription. So you're in the office, but you're not actually seeing the GP, or maybe you're seeing the nurse for some kind of injection. But anyway, this point, we have to go back and think, what was the objective to this question? It's so important for each and every question in our survey, we know exactly what it's trying to measure. And then we could make this better. So I put this in here to just demonstrate some trade-offs in questionnaire design. Within a question, all ambiguous words should be clarified, but at the same time, it should be short and simple. And of course, you can see those are pulling in two different directions. So to illustrate that, which of these would you prefer? I'm going to read them out. I'd like you to think about how much time you spend commuting to work. When coming up with a total, only include time spent as a driver of a motor vehicle. Please only think about the most recent time you drove to work in the last 7 days. In the last 7 days, how much time did you spend commuting to work on the last day you drove to work? Oh, can you imagine if every question was like that? People would lose the will to do the survey. But let's say that you're in your process of writing your survey question and you're following that rule and everything's clarified, and all of a sudden it just expands into something like version A. But we can see here it's longer purely because it's very repetitive. So then we can come in with our questionnaire design machete and cut it back and end up with something like version B. Thinking about the most recent time you drove yourself to work during the last 7 days, how long did you spend driving? Now, this is going to be open-ended numeric. And a good rule of thumb is when you have open-ended numeric to put in some kind of rounding rule. But don't use the term rounding because not everybody rounds correctly. So this just says, please answer to the nearest quarter of an hour. And then our second trade-off, it could be that we ended up with some crazy long question. And there isn't any way to chop it back. Maybe it's better handled by a series of short, simple questions. That's always an option. But of course, that's a trade-off with having a longer questionnaire. And yes, that can lead to non-response. particularly if we are going to be doing web surveys, where extra questions make more of an impact than they do with an interview survey. All right, just a few guidelines, questionnaire design, because I was asked to put this in today. So these are the obvious ones, but we've got to state the obvious ones. So we're going to avoid long, complex questions, complex terms, concepts, acronyms, jargon words. And of course, there is an exception. You might be going to professional statisticians. And of course, with professional statisticians, they're going to know certain jargon words that are particular statistics that other people might not. So if the word is known to your respondents, that's absolutely fine. But we have to be aware, in addition to all that complexity, that simple words and phrases are a problem. So I've already mentioned last week is also a problem. And in English, you is a problem. And these problems are just simply hidden without proper testing. So just a little anecdote. So I've done a lot of cognitive interviewing. And let's say we've got the situation where the question is, what do you like best about your neighborhood? Now, the interviewer, so let me take that back. I'm going to do just a standard interview, not a cognitive interview. So just a standard interview. So this is what this is saying, that without the testing, just the standard interview isn't going to pick it up. Because in the standard interview, we might have some person who doesn't know what neighborhood is, says something to the standard interviewer, and then the interviewer is going, aha, ambiguous term, makes note. But, you know, the next person, it's like, oh, yeah, I don't know what it means. I'm just too shy, you know. So they don't say anything to the interviewer, and then the interviewer thinks it's fine. And then, you know, the next person along, they don't know what it means, but they just can't be bothered. So again, the interviewer doesn't know there's a problem. And then there's the people who think they know, but if they'd asked, they'd find out they don't know, and so on. So there's just so many things buried, and unless we do something like the cognitive interviewing. Okay, so other rules. Avoid respondents doing maths in their heads. What proportion of your evening viewing time do you spend watching news programs? That's crazy. You've got to think about evening viewing, you've got to think about news programs, and then you've got to divide one by the other. And it could be in hours and minutes. So, you know, if we did have to do this, we need better questions. Have 2 questions, and then let the computer do the division. Asking more than one question at a time. Would you like to be rich and famous? Here it's the and. So if you want to be both, it's fine, or neither is fine. But if you want to be rich but not famous, you're stuck. Avoid questions that impose unwarranted assumptions. Where did you go on holiday last year? But I didn't go on holiday last year. So that ideally should have a filter question. Did you go on holiday last year? Yes or no? And then where? Sometimes in questionnaires, there are not applicables. And if we think more about self-completion, and that's okay. All right, the person can see, all right, doesn't apply to me. Here's the not applicable category. Okay. But let's say that the very first question doesn't apply. Third question doesn't apply. Fifth question doesn't apply. And about that point, the respondent's thinking, nah, I think most of this doesn't apply, and just breaks off. So it's about getting the right balance. Avoid question and answer mismatch. Are you a registered user of the library? That's a yes/no question. But the answer categories are student, faculty, and visitor. Clarify what constitutes constitutes an adequate answer. When did you move to this community? Possible answers. You know, we're thinking we're going to get really clear answers, but would you like to analyze the data when it says 1953, when I was married, when I was 16? Ooh. But all we would have had to have done is to make a clearer question so that it was people knew what kind of answer was adequate. We could have just said, in what year did you move to the community? Now, in subjective questions, we have middle categories, and there's always a huge debate about middle categories. Yes, respondents may hold a true middle position, but there's also a concept that came from John Krosnick in 1991 called satisficing. It's not a real English word, but it's basically taking the easy way out. I don't have to think about the question. I just hide in the middle category. I move into the next one. So yes, middle categories can be a danger zone for satisficing. But ideally, it should be a decision based on the objective of your question. Maybe you have a question where you have to have a middle category. Or maybe you have a question where it's fine, you just want people to take a side, positive or negative. If you are including a middle category, make sure you use 5 or 7 categories rather than 3. If you think about this, it makes a lot of sense. I was involved in a research grant a few years back, and we had a little experiment of 3 versus 7, exactly the same question. And we were also doing it in interview modes, face-to-face and telephone and web. And we got far more middle category choosing when it was 3 across all the modes, and even more middle category choosing in web. Because if you think about it, if you've only got 1 and 3, and you think, well, you know, that's excellent, that's poor, you know, well, neither of those, oh, I guess I have to pick the middle. So 5 or 7 gives more categories so people can actually find a place to better fit their feelings. Okay, now I'm being Fowler from improving survey questions. No opinion. Sometimes people think no opinion should be in the center. I mean, respondents won't know the difference, but technically the middle category should be a place on a continuum of an attitude. So we're going along and it's like, oh, I'm very positive, I'm very positive, I'm less positive, and then I'm negative, I'm very negative. So it should be some in a neutral position rather than a no opinion position. So what about don't know and no opinion? Again, these are a place for satisficing. So be very careful of putting a don't know or no opinion category. Usually in an interview survey, it's always on the page, but it's not read out. It's just there in case respondents volunteer it. But it's in the self-completion. How do you make that comparable? That's where the problem is. So here's something from Royal Mail in the UK. Would you say the office where you collected this questionnaire was your usual post office, which you use most often? And there's a don't know. I mean, that would be just so easy not to think about it and mark don't know, because there have been many generations of experiments looking at including the category or not, and you can easily end up with an extra 20% of cases choosing it if it's there. So you'd have to think, does it really have to be there? Surely you'd know if it's your usual post office. Okay, maybe 2% wouldn't, but is it worth risking putting a don't know in? So if you want to know about people's knowledge before putting don't know in, you can actually do that through cognitive interviewing. All right, numbers of answer categories. For factual questions, nobody's really come out and said, this is the limit, because I have seen things from market research where there's like 100 categories in the first question. I'm thinking about all the different products I could buy. But we just have to be aware that there is something called a primacy effect that happens when you're seeing things visually, and a recency effect if you're hearing things. So primacy effects usually happen when you're seeing them, and that means you're more likely just to pick from the first few categories. So again, satisficing. I didn't have to read all of them. I've satisfied a task. I've just picked something from the beginning. And then recency happens with oral because it's easier to remember what you most recently heard. And this doesn't happen all the time because it's mixed very much with respondent motivation. It's mixed with how interesting the topic is, and so forth. Added 2 questions though, 4 to 7 categories. Remember to avoid 3. It is known that the longer scales, 6 and 7, give better measurement, but they're actually tougher to complete. Longer scales need to be bipolar. What does that mean? It's not bipolar disease. Okay, so I'm just looking at my clock. Bipolar represents two opposing opposites. Unipolar, with a neutral position in the middle. Unipolar is just one side and then down to nothing. And you can have 0 to 10 scales, but you've got to label 5 because there have been 2 different interpretations. Be careful of scales that are just labeled on the ends anyway. We could consider that lazy questionnaire design just because they are more difficult for respondents. Not 0 or 10, but you could do it. 0 to 10 is fine. Yeah, it has to be end labeled. But if you had, let's say, 1 to 5 and you just labeled the ends. Okay, I think we're going to be all right. So in the appendix are some formats to avoid: agree, disagree, tick all that apply, and some things to be aware of: hypothetical questions, satisfaction questions, and the net promoter score. So details on that in the appendix. And we've got just 2 slides, sticking to time here. So the analysis of the cognitive data. It can be very simple. Gordon Willis, who is the person who wrote the first book, who really engaged with cognitive interviewing. Cognitive interviewing was born in the States. He was at the National Center for Health Statistics at that time. So in his first manual before his book, what he did is he said, okay, just take your computerized document, or paper back then, take your computerized document, and here you have your questionnaire. And then what you do, here's the first question, and then let's say you have 15 respondents. So what you do is you write, okay, these were the problems with my first respondent, these are the problems with my second respondent, these were the problems with my third, fourth, fifth, and then all the way down to 15. So now, summarized right under the question is everything that was a problem. So cognitive interviewing analysis can be that simple. But if you are a National Statistical Institute, then you're probably wanting to do something far more sophisticated. You're probably going to want to look at subgroup differences. And then you're going to need software. There is a suggestion here of Q notes specifically designed for cognitive interviewing. Or you could see, as some people do, that cognitive interviewing is fully qualitative and you could use any of the qualitative software. So then it is much, much more time consuming because you really are trying to go into depth about what's happening for subgroups. Okay, my last slide here. How do you fix the survey questions based on your test results? So let's say we have the following question, and there's some background information, and that's not given to the respondent, that's just to us. The following question is from a series of questions about foods people eat. The question is about real butter rather than margarine or butter substitutes. And all the respondent sees is how often do you have butter? Now, there's lots of possible problems with this. So I'm just going to go out of PowerPoint for just a second. I'm going to write some of these on this Word document I have prepared. Okay, so first we could think about things that are comprehension. So how often do you have butter? So what do we mean? Again, it's the classic case. Is it butter or margarine? Because, of course, people don't know that background information. Sorry, don't type very well. Margarine, there we go. There's also the really weird word have. That doesn't say eat butter, it says have butter. So does that mean you have butter in your fridge? And you should answer yes. So what do we mean by have in this particular case? And then there's also the issue that we have no time frame. And then if we were in English, then we have the problem of you. So is it just you eating butter or is it your family eating butter? And I've sort of skipped around. It's not completely comprehension, but we'll come back in a minute. because I'm just taking these as I'm remembering them. Okay, and my memory isn't categorized. Then, I had several things more, and it can be sensitive because real butter kind of goes in and out of fashion. So it could be possibly sensitive. We could have all sorts. It's an open question. We could have all sorts of weird answers. Some people could say often, and some people could give an actual number. Okay, I'll just stop there. We could find a few more if we wanted. So what I'm going to show you is what I typically do. And this is if I'm going to just do a very simple analysis of the cognitive data. So let's pretend that this came from a cognitive interview rather than just me telling you this. So this first one is clearly comprehension. And then whether you have it or not, it's comprehension. And now I remember the other thing I wanted to say. Is it in food or on food? We don't know that. And that's another one that's comprehension. Now, there is no time frame, but this is just telling us that when we do have a time frame, and let me just make this a bit bigger. I'm aware that I could do that, so it's a little bit easier to see. Sorry about that. So it means when we do put a time frame in, we have to think about respondents' memory. And it's very surprising how little people remember. You know, there was a study where 10 years on, people had forgotten that they had a legal will for when they died. So we don't want to overestimate memory. So this I'm just going to put under memory. And then whether you is singular or plural in English is more comprehension. And then possibly sensitive. So that's that last category about response. And then the answer categories are something that we just need to think about to fix. So I think this would be much better with answer categories, because then it would define what we mean by often. So I'm just going to write fix. Now, what I have done in the appendix is I've given you solutions to ambiguous terms. So let's say this is actually your question. And then you take, okay, for all the comprehension problems, now Pam has given me a list of ways that I can fix the comprehension problem. So I'll look at that part of the appendix. And then I have another part of the appendix on ways to help people remember things. So when I'm going to set a time frame, then I'm going to look at that appendix. And then finally, there's also an appendix on when you have to ask a sensitive question. The appendix is set up, things you can do at the level of data collection, things you can do at the level of the questionnaire, and things you can do in terms of individual wordings of actual questions. So you can look at that appendix and decide what you're going to do. So that's going to give you some ideas to come back. And then it's a matter of maybe, this is up to you, creating a very long, crazy question and then cutting it back, or maybe that's not your style. But the idea is to improve each of these things and also to keep it short and simple. And that will take some iterations. But that's just one example of how we could take some cognitive interview findings and improve the question. All right, so thank you for that. And my last slide is just a thank you. And I am putting my email address up there. I'm happy if anybody comes back to me afterwards if they do have questions, because I know there's going to be only some limited time for questions because it is a webinar. So happy to hear from you. And here's the appendix. So we've got the other cognitive interviewing techniques. We've got structuring the cognitive interview, so you would feel more comfortable in doing it. We've got the question formats to avoid, and then the slides on aid to question revision are the ones I just spoke about. And I truly am done now. So ready for questions.
Thank you, Pamela. Yes, indeed, we already received a couple of questions. So one was about how often is acceptable to ask the same respondents to come to cognitive testing groups.
Oh, yes. I personally like different respondents every time. I do know we have to just be careful. I'm just going to give a different context just for a moment. There are agencies, at least in the UK, that, you know, if you needed focus group participants or cognitive interview participants or just qualitative participants, that have a pool of participants and they would give you some participants. But you really do have to be careful that these don't become professional respondents. So although that's very easy access to get to those respondents, yeah, I would really try to have new, fresh respondents every time if possible. But it is then more expense in terms of recruiting.
Yeah. Okay, now we have a different question is about training interviewers. How long does it take? Some ideas on that?
Yes. Yes, I've done a lot of this. Usually I do a 2-day course with them. And I'm taking people who are new to cognitive interviewing. And, you know, in the first day, they're just practicing with some set questions. And then the second day, we bring in some, so it depends on who we're training. So I'm giving an example from New Mexico State University. So the host for that, I was brought in to train up cognitive interviewers, and the host brought in some respondents for the second day. So we had some actual questionnaires the second day, and we had some actual respondents. All right, so that's kind of the initial training, but then you want to monitor each respondent. So they're going to then send them out to do 5 interviews all on their own, and you want to hear those recordings and give them feedback, because it's really around 5-6 times before they start to feel comfortable, and hopefully they're feeling comfortable with good behavior and they haven't actually started to form poor behavior. So that's why you really need to listen to the recordings and give some feedback. So it's very intensive to train them up. And then you also want to check on them, you know, every couple of months or like every, you know, 20th interview, just to make sure they haven't developed any poor habits.
Okay, thank you. And we have another question. Can a response be influenced by thinking aloud, in the sense that if you want to think aloud, I may give different response?
Okay, that's a great question. So think-aloud came from something called protocol analysis. And the authors of protocol analysis, this was just from psychology, they were looking at verbalizations as data. And, you know, does it actually change people from saying it out loud? And what they found, of course, is that it is a little bit, it's Erickson and Simon, took a minute to get the authors. It takes longer, of course, to report it out loud than to do it silently. But they found in the great majority of cases, there wasn't actually a difference of what was coming out. And in the few cases where you were getting differences because people were speaking it out loud, it was minor things. And just to add to that, though, when people are, sometimes they can think aloud for a long time, or sometimes with your probes, really useful thing is to round it up and say, what were you thinking when you first looked at the question? Because sometimes people can overanalyze, and it's not so much think aloud technique, it's just that we're getting them to focus on the question. So we constantly want to say, but were you thinking that when you first saw it?
Okay, thank you. I don't see any other question for the moment. I just wanted to ask you if you have any special final tip for our students. So you already included some tips about questionnaire design. So I guess maybe your suggestion could be to start from there. Yeah, and then maybe to go on with these more specific techniques like cognitive interviewing.
Yes, so the key thing is to practice with questionnaire design. And then, I mean, I love cognitive interviewing, but there are lots of different testing methods. So, you know, the first step is to design the questions and polish the questions before you spend any money on a testing method. I know this gets away from cognitive interviewing, but I have a course where there's 21 ways to test your survey questions. So if there was any interest, I could send along that page of 21 ways. I guess I would send that to you, Katarina.
Okay, thank you. And we have another question. Can we use respondents who answered similar to thinking aloud question as a validity check for an aptitude question measured through a series of Likert scale questions?
Yes, so some people view that cognitive interviewing can help validate a questionnaire because it's more common, not just in the questionnaire, but to validate a translation. So cognitive interviewing is very common in seeing if a translation actually means what we think it means. It's very hard to find a good way to validate your questionnaire unless you're working psychometrically. And then you've got to put in an alternative construct of what it is you have there in the first place. And if you had 100 questions, then you'd have to have 100 alternative constructs to put in. But yes, in the literature, some people have used cognitive interviewing to validate a construct or a questionnaire.
Okay, thank you. So I think the time is over. I don't see other questions. So I really would like to thank you, Pamela, for this very interesting presentation. And yeah, I remember all the participants that your slides are updated already on our website and with all the additional, the appendix, the additional materials. So of course, I also would like to thank very much all our participants who joined us today from many different countries all over the world. So on the website, you find all the materials. And of course, the recording of the webinar will be also available on this YouTube channel. In the meantime, I will kindly ask you to check the inbox of the email account that you use for registering to the webinar, as you are going to receive the link to a short survey about today's webinar. We'd really appreciate your feedback to further improve our webinars. So the next webinar, that will be the last one of the spring session of the EMOS 2021 webinars, is scheduled in 2 weeks on Tuesday, the 11th of May, when Marco Putz and Piet Das from Statistics Netherlands will present on machine learning from a statistical perspective. So thank you for now. Thank you again, Pamela, and I wish everyone a nice evening. So bye-bye. Thank you.